So today I'm going to address how many Ukrainian casualties have we seen since the beginning of the war. Now, I don't know that I could have done this video before because an article just came out a couple days ago that helps me with this, and I keep getting this request. How many Ukrainian casualties are there? Now, I've done different videos about how many Russian casualties there are numerous times because it's easier to get that. The West has been more focused on Russian casualties. The Ukrainians, neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians put out estimates, right? And I get why they wouldn't do that, but the Russians generally say we killed X number and we only took a tenth of the losses. Well, they're just simply lying. It's never going to be that lopsided, but there are ways of ferreting this out. So let's start here with just a little search. A little Google search will show you, and by the way, I'm going to do my best to show you what open source research has to say about this. I don't have esoteric knowledge like Doug McGregor will always talk, well, I just got this report from this source in such and such. It's not like that. And I don't believe his Gnostic sources are actually telling him truth. But at any rate, let's keep going. Russian military casualties, the official says, are approaching 300,000. The number includes as many as 120,000 and 170 to 180 troops. The Russian numbers dwarf the Ukrainian figures, which officials put close to 70,000 killed and 100,000 to 120,000 wounded. Now, that is from the New York Times as of just 2 days ago. So the Russian casualties are far higher, but the Russians don't tend to mind because they have many more people and they don't value life in the same way that we might wish that they would in the West. Okay, if we look at Wikipedia has put out a couple of different iterations of this. This is that figure I just talked about, the U.S. estimate that just came from the New York Times. And there were a few Ukrainian government estimates early on in the war, but they only covered certain time periods and then they were tight-lipped. So that wasn't a lot of help. What was a lot of help was articles in the last few days, the New York Times articles, and I'm going to show you a Guardian article and a Radio Free Europe article that talks about this as well. U.S. estimates almost 500,000 Russian and Ukrainian military casualties, and that's combined since the war began. Russia's military casualties are approaching 300,000, the officials claimed, with as many as 120,000 killed in action. Ukraine was said to have close to 70,000 killed and 100 to 120,000 wounded. Russia's standing army is between 2 to 3 times larger than Ukraine's, and the country has a larger population from which to replenish its frontline soldiers. Ukraine has about 500,000 troops, while Russia has more than 1.3 million, the newspaper estimated, including reserves and Wagner paramilitaries. Okay, there's not just Wagner, which is now decimated, but they were reasonably effective until they were decimated. Reserves mobilize fighters from the Donbass that didn't want to, and I read an article that there was 60,000 something of Ukrainians in Donbass that whether they wanted to fight for Russia or not were mobilized into that force. The reports, now by the way, they're saying that there's 500,000 troops in Ukraine, and the next article I'm going to show you shows you a very different figure. So this is an imperfect kind of science. The reports of 120,000 Russian soldiers killed is considerably higher than the numbers confirmed by Russian journalists monitoring the conflict. Wait, I thought you were talking about Ukrainian. I am, but let me just show you something. Okay, using open source data, Medusa and BBC Russian have confirmed the deaths of 30,000 Russian soldiers with social media reports from relatives, reports on local media, or local government statements. So there's a floor of at least 30,000. And then if you use this, and this is an interesting way of going about processing this. You could do this like they did this after COVID to determine what the effect of COVID was as opposed to just normal deaths in the population. Using data on excess deaths, or it's called excess mortality, from public records, Medusa and Mediazona estimate that 47,000 soldiers had been killed during the war. That's in Russia, not counting those from occupied territories of East Ukraine that I just mentioned. So 47, like pure Russians, not Donbass residents mobilized. So a floor of 47,000. And by the way, I talked about that in this video, how many Russian casualties, what statistics tell us about the casualties in Ukraine. And I've done others about how many Russian casualties before a number of times. Okay, so we're at a floor of about 50,000 dead Russians. Okay, let's go on to this. Amid corruption scandals and mounting problems, Ukraine vows to shake up the military enlistment system. It's a tough task, and they have had some significant problems here. Borisev, this guy here, he's a piece of crap. Traitor, really. I mean, he was profiting off, and he's in charge of recruiting, and he's profiting off that. He was dismissed from his post and subject to criminal inquiry. Ukraine's National Agency for the Prevention of Corruption later stated that he had illegally enriched himself to the tune of 188 million hryvnias, that's about $5 million, by deciding who gets sent to the front or who gets sent somewhere else. And wow, I mean, that's wow. Okay, so there is corruption, and that's a bad thing, but that's a sidebar issue, and they're working to root that out. Zelensky came out last week saying from now on we're just going to have soldiers who have been to the front line, those who maybe have been injured or whatever will be those that are the commissars for recruiting in Ukraine moving forward. Okay. At the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion, lines in the front of the military recruitment centers were a common sight as Ukrainians rushed to defend their country. Since then, the nation of roughly 40 million has assembled an army of some 700,000 soldiers. Now, remember, the other figure in the last article is 500,000. And I'm not changing my tune. I'm just reporting what's in the papers here. So we're not going to get necessarily the right figures, but we can get into a ballpark. 700,000 soldiers plus up to 250 servicemen in the National Guard, or up to 1 million soldiers defending Ukraine. Now that's a very different picture when you think that there's upwards of 1 million Ukrainians defending the place when you had an initial invasion force of 200,000 or so Russians, and then you had another 300,000 plus mobilized, and a few 10,000 or some tens of thousands more in an ongoing way monthly, right? So Ukraine is still pretty strong, and I'm going to talk about this in another video, just how strong Ukraine actually is. Okay, so 700 plus 200,000, and according to Defense Minister Reznikov. An unknown number of people have bribed military recruiters to avoid compulsory service. Others have gone abroad despite a ban on leaving the country for almost all Ukrainian men aged 18 to 60 are, I mean, you're liable to, it's martial law, and you're required to stay and fight unless you're either unqualified physically or you have certain things like a child or whatever. But a number have fled over the border. In fact, a number is something like hundreds that have fled over the border into Romania. I read a report the other day. There's going to be cowards in pretty much any country who are going to do what's best for them regardless of what's going on. So that's a pretty small figure compared to the 1 million that fled from Russia when mobilization was announced. Okay, August 18th report, the New York Times. So today is August 20th as I'm recording this. August 18th report, the New York Times cited U.S. officials it did not name as saying close to 70,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed and 100,000 to 120,000 had been wounded. Okay, so it gives us a figure. Could it go up? Is that give or take 50,000? I don't know, but that's still nothing near the 300 or 400,000 that you hear the Russians parrot. And if you read Russian media or Russian repeaters, if you watch them, like Douglas McGregor and Ritter, you'll hear that. In fact, I'll show you something about them saying 400,000 in just a little bit. Okay, so the article goes on. Last little bit I want to share here. In theory, the distribution of a draft notice does not mean immediate dispatch to the front, but all men aged 18 to 60 can be called up for military service if they have no legal grounds for postponement or exclusion, such as illness, disability of the draftee or dependent, or of a specific family situation, such as single parenthood or 3 or more dependent children. So basically all men 18 to 60 are required to serve, and again, this is a time of military preparedness because we're all hands on deck. Okay, so let's look at this. Now, this is February 23 of 2023, 1 year into the war, and Eurasian Times was repeating the Russian claim that there were 400,000 casualties and millions, right? I mean, they're already repeating what's going on. Here's Doug McGregor talking to Jackson Hinkle about Russia has eliminated 400,000 soldiers so far. That means killed. Listen to McGregor talk, and I apologize for the sound if there's a defect here.
I think I can answer some of it very easily. I just received some overhead surveillance material from Ukraine.
Again, Douglas McGregor always goes on these Gnostic sources that he has that are telling him things, and very often it's just what RT is parroting, but let's hear what he has to say.
And the overhead surveillance photographs or pictures show 123,000 freshly dug graves. And the estimate at the bottom of the picture is that 400,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed thus far.
Okay, and that's the kind of thing that he and Ritter and others are repeating. That's what the Russians will say. And the Russians, when they put out in RT, for example, they'll put out things like, we lost 243 soldiers and the Ukrainians lost 2,459 soldiers in this engagement. Like, they'll put out these crazy estimates. I don't believe it any further than I can throw it. Okay, so what's the correct answer? I honestly don't know what the correct answer is. I mean, it's just a hard thing to figure out. But it looks like the Russians have taken about twice the number of casualties that the Ukrainians have taken, in a very, very rough cut, maybe a little bit less than that, but it's from what we can detect here from, and I'm using U.S. sources. Now, there are also Ukrainian sources that show that it's higher because they're keeping a different count. They're keeping a count, and they may have more of an accurate view from where they are on the ground. I'm trying to use conservative U.S. kind of sources. We know that there's a ground floor of about 50,000 Russians that have to have been killed. I mean, we can tell that. And it looks like it's many times higher than that. But again, this is all hard to determine. When you're looking at how many Ukrainians have been how many Ukrainian casualties. I think that the New York Times estimate of 70,000 and about 100 to 120,000 wounded is probably a pretty fair thing, but we just don't know. There's the fog of war. And you also have to factor in the other damage, like civilians that have been killed, 10,000 or so civilians, 500 at least children among those 10,000 or so civilians, and then the damage to the economy, which is got to be approaching $1 trillion worth of damage to infrastructure in the economy. It was at about $500 billion only 6 months ago or so. So it's got to be moving that direction. So there's a lot to try to take in, but the numbers are not what you'll hear from folks like Ritter and McGregor and other Russian repeaters. So you can safely ignore that. I hope that helps you. Please go back and look at the other videos that I've talked about if you want to understand how the casualty figures are, what the Russian figures are. And again, these are dated, but it'll still help you have some context for that. Thank you for your time, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine. I'll be back tomorrow. I hope you'll subscribe and be back too.